The Cannabis Conversation. A European perspective on the emerging legal cannabis industry.
Welcome to the Cannabis Conversation with the New Society, where we explore the new legal cannabis industry by speaking to the professionals that are helping to shape it. On today's show, I have Dr. Graham Wood. Graham is Chief Scientific Officer for Neptune Wellness Solutions, which is a cannabis and CBD company. Graham, how are you?
I'm good. How are you this morning? Or I guess this afternoon for you.
Yes, it is this afternoon. Yeah, very good. Thank you. Welcome to the show.
Glad to be here.
Good. Cool. So, there's a few different topics to talk about actually today, but why don't we start with the usual and get a bit of background on you and, what you do and how you sort of came to be in the cannabis industry.
Okay, let me start, I guess, with the why. So I'd been running clinical pharmacology studies for different pharmaceutical companies for years, actually about 20 years. And in that chance, I got to run kind of every different type of product, different indications. It was a really great experience. About 10 years ago, I think, is when I had my first chance to work on a cannabis project. It was actually for dronabinol and Sativex. But it was really about 4 years ago when it really took off, and a lot of it had to do. I'm based in Canada, and Canada obviously was in the process of legalizing. So a lot of companies were jumping in, not just on the kind of medicinal rec side, but also on the actual developing cannabis as a full drug. And I just really enjoyed they were fun studies. In the end, we did around about 40 different studies at my previous company. So it really piqued my interest, and this interesting growing industry. It's the research is lagging because there was so much restriction. So it seemed like a great place to go as my next career step, I guess. And the how is really, I went out looking I wanted to find the right cannabis company. I think there's different ways to approach it. And I wanted a company that really was focusing on the R&D, the importance of R&D and backing up, not just coming out with these cool strain names that sound really sexy, but really backing it up with science. And I came across Neptune. They were like 3 blocks from where I previously worked. And they have a fantastic history of really using R&D to build up their products and really show that they work. So it just seemed like a great fit.
Great, fantastic. Yeah, really interesting what you say about R&D. We'll talk about that in a minute. So tell me a bit more about Neptune then and what you guys are up to there.
So Neptune has been around for 20 plus years. A bit of an interesting history because it's taken a few shifts through the years. So they actually got started doing extracting omega-3s from krill. So basically making krill oil and selling it into supplements. They had their own brand. They sold to many other different brands, and you'll still see omega-3s that will say NKO inside. That's Neptune krill oil. But then about 3 years ago, they decided to do a shift going from extracting omega-3s to extracting cannabis. So January of 2019 is when we received our license from Health Canada, and then soon after we started extracting. We also have different sides of the business. So we do white label products across the whole wellness industry. So we still do a lot of omega-3s. We actually have a proprietary omega-3 formulation called Maximil. So it is a pretty varied company. We're doing consumer products now. We're doing hand sanitizers. So it's taken a number of shifts. And the Neptune name obviously comes from our omega-3 history. But we're pretty broad-based right now, not just omega-3s.
Fantastic. So bringing some established expertise to this new sector, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, look, there's quite a bit to talk about here, and I guess one of the main first topics is R&D, which you've mentioned a few times. So obviously it's quite an open question, but you've got both background in R&D, and obviously it's part of what you do at Neptune. How important is it in your role and in the wider cannabis industry as well?
So in my role, it's definitely pretty much all I do, which is why I really enjoy it. So I mean, from working on different formulations that would be suitable for different potential indications. And that's the part that really falls into my background really nicely. But some of the really exciting stuff I get to do now is working with we have a big pool of scientists and engineers, working with them on new extraction techniques. And that's something new. I mean, before for me, I was always testing someone else's products. So now getting to do also figuring out the most efficient ways of producing our own product is a really exciting development for me. Now, in terms of the industry, I mean, obviously I'm very biased here, but I mean, to me, R&D is incredibly important. And I alluded to before, I mean, really, this is a product that's been used for millennia, but there's so little research in a way. Besides, I mean, obviously, millions of people having used it, there's not a lot of really good research on it. And it's not lack of interest, it's just the restrictions on it was so difficult. That has really changed over the last few years. We still need, I'll leave some countries nameless. We still need some countries to loosen it up a little bit more, but we're making the right progress in being able to do the studies that really, and it's really going to help people as we go forward as an industry.
Yeah. Yeah. And can you talk about some of those exciting areas that you mentioned? The ones you personally find interesting, I suppose.
Well, I mean, pretty much. I mean, I find there's tons of them that are really interesting. I mean, even you think of COVID right now, people are actively investigating the potential use of especially CBD in COVID. Really the potential uses of cannabis is huge, and I think important part is we got to remember it's not. We say cannabis like it's one thing, but the plant
Mhm.
contains so many different, I mean, over 80 cannabinoids plus hundreds of terpenes and flavonoids. So it's not one thing. It's tons of different things kind of packed into one plant. Each of them that act quite differently, either alone or when you put them together. I mean, I'm a really firm believer in the entourage effect, which is that when you give the product that's kind of the fuller spectrum of what's in there, there definitely seems like there's better efficacy. But I mean, this is where R&D comes in. Maybe for certain indications, it's really better to have something that's quite focused. Like THCV is really actively being looked at for diabetes because it looks like it can actually help your cells in your body uptake the sugar from your bloodstream to help control the sugar levels. So there's so many different potentials with the product, which is kind of what makes it so interesting.
Yeah, but I guess it can be a bit of a double-edged sword because, as you say, I mean, there's obviously so many moving parts in it. Is it a bit difficult to know where to start?
Oh, 100%. I mean, a process of elimination, what is it in there that's doing, you see this great effect if you're giving, say, a full spectrum product. Well, what was it that caused that effect? Was it one thing? Was it three things working together? I mean, the good news is it's going to keep people like me gainfully employed for a long time, figuring this all out. But yeah, there's some fantastic, great potential in there that we've got to really dig down deep to find out why certain things are acting one way, others another. There's a lot of research that's got to go into that to kind of parse out those different aspects.
Yeah, yeah, I love talking to scientists because they're just how excited they get at the sheer amount of things to discover. So I can imagine, it must be a very exciting challenge for you. So, how do you think sort of research and development can help businesses to differentiate in the space? 'Cause a lot of people trying to do the same thing. So, and how do you think Neptune does that as well?
So, I mean, I think in general, R&D really, because that's really what companies can do to set themselves apart. There's a lot of people out there putting out different strains, different delivery forms, but really, I mean, the R&D can really help you have delivery forms that really are better than the others. Like we have a actually an omega-3 product, Maximal, where we've patented to show that it actually helps the absorption of cannabinoids. So it's great. We're putting together another natural product with it. They actually, omega 3s, especially CBD, very similar effects. And now they're going together. You have better absorption, plus they're working on the same system. So, I mean, it's a great example of how R&D can really help differentiate on the product. So there's just tons of interesting areas being looked into. in terms of R&D to make it different. And especially in Canada, it's tough. We can't differentiate too much on marketing. We're very restricted on what we're allowed to market. So giving something that consumer can take and obviously feel a difference, that's really where you're going to differentiate rather than having the fanciest labels that pull you in, the best website and stuff. That still matters a bit, but you're so limited what you're allowed to do here. It makes it difficult.
Yeah, yeah, I find it really fascinating and an exciting area to kind of mix cannabis-based products with non-cannabis-based products to sort of increase effectiveness, delivery, absorption, all those sort of things. So it sounds like you guys are really well placed to sort of capitalize on that.
Yeah, it's a really active area that we've been developing stuff internally, as well as looking to license what other people have developed to make sure that we have a really good portfolio of IP that can make all our products, either the products, because we make products under our own brand, as we also do white labels for others. So it can benefit both of those.
Yeah, loads of exciting stuff there. I mean, your background. You've got a PhD in neuroscience and neurosurgery. I see. So, are there specific areas in relation to the brain that you're getting quite excited about?
Yeah, it's actually, when you look at the list, it seems like a bit of wishful thinking. And as a scientist, you see this long list of things that's being studied for, and you're like, whoa, that's just kind of crazy. But just to prepare for that, I started creating the list. We have insomnia, neuropathic pain, there's chronic pain, there's epilepsy. Obviously, GW Pharma's Epidiolex was approved for epilepsy, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, a way to combat opioid addiction, Parkinson's, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury. And I'm sure I've missed tons of exciting areas in neuroscience that is being looked at. And like I said, first you hear that list and you're like, oh, there's no way. This isn't some magic elixir. But as we talked before, there's so many different things or different cannabinoids plus non-cannabinoids that are in this plant that we can't think it's not one thing necessarily potentially working in all these areas. It's different things potentially working in all these areas. But the other thing is that big part of what cannabinoids do is work with the immune system and the inflammatory system, which are very linked together. So, they can stop, programmed cell death, apoptosis. It can interact with that, inflammation. And what we've probably seen last 20 years, I think the one defining thing in science is inflammation is kind of attached to so many different things. Diabetes is most of the issues are based off of inflammation. Back to the brain, Parkinson is very much inflammation, and obviously traumatic brain injury. So there is a scientific reasoning for why it could work in all these areas.
Yeah, yeah. It's just we could talk for hours on all this stuff. It's kind of endless, isn't it? And as we keep saying, we're just at the beginning. Okay, cool. Well, thank you for that. It's a good summary of the broad range of R&D. So I understand a particular area of interest you use around absorption into the body, and I think you mentioned it briefly before. Is that effectively the same as bioavailability? Is that the same sort of area?
Exactly, yeah. So, having my background in clinical pharmacology, really the studies I was doing when I was working in the pharmaceutical industry was that first study of like a first in human study looking at where at that point you have no idea what it does in the body, where it goes, how fast it gets out. So it was a huge part of that. And then even into the kind of the proof of concept studies where you're really trying to tie the dose that's in the blood to, or concentration in the blood to the negative and positive effects you're seeing. So a lot of that interest is really kind of brought into the cannabis industry. And I think one of the first studies I did with cannabis, we actually noticed that people were fainting. Others were getting really anxious. And these were we recruited people who had prior experience with cannabis. But what it turned out is when we looked at the data after dosing that first group is the people who hadn't used in months, they were the ones who that relatively low dose caused them issues. So when we went into the next group of subjects, we started actually starting them on an even lower dose and worked their way up. All of a sudden, all the negative effects went away. So the absorption really does tie into a lot to the adverse effects people see, as well as the benefits. You need to pick the right absorption to get the right benefit.
Yeah. So, and what sort of factors that influence absorption then? You talked about proximity to your last dose being one of them, but what are the other sort of main ones that, and it's probably a very long answer.
Well, I mean, I don't think it's actually the two biggest, I would say. Really, one is the route of administration, and the other is if it's an ingested form. And this is what surprises a lot of people, it's actually what you've eaten. So first, I mean, route of administration, obviously, if you inhale your cannabis, so if you either combustion or vaping, that's where it's going to hit the fastest. And I mean, studies that I've worked on, you see in the literature, it's usually before even 10 minutes, you have the maximum blood levels. It's probably the effects are maybe a little bit behind because it takes a little bit longer to get up into the brain, but you're seeing effects really, really quickly with combustion. But then if you go to, say, something like a sublingual dose where you leave it under your tongue to absorb, that's kind of like the next fastest, and that's probably in the half hour to 45 minutes. And then if you go to eating, then it's much, much longer. It's an hour or more. So really how you administer it has a huge effect on how fast it hits, but also the kind of the profile. Like you smoke it, it goes up really fast, down really fast. Versus you eat it, you have it's a slow rise, and then you have nice steady levels and then slowly back down. So you really got to pick your delivery system for what the type of effects you want to see. And then, as I mentioned, eating it, or sorry, I should say ingesting it. So it could be in a capsule form, it could be in a food like a gummy, whatever form you're ingesting. It really depends on what's in your stomach, on how much it gets absorbed. So if you look at dronabinol is a great example, and just read in the label, 1 hour is what, if you eat it you fasted overnight and sorry, I shouldn't say eat it, you take your dronabinol, it's going to hit in about an hour. But if you have a high fat meal, then it's going to take 4 hours to hit, but the amount that absorbs is much higher after that high fat meal. So hugely different effect, all based on what's in your stomach. And the same thing can be said. So if you're eating it in a fatty, say, brownie, versus you're ingesting it in a pill, again, that extra fat in there is going to change the absorption. And a lot of what you see where people have adverse effects, it's because of this variability that you see with, you take it once and you feel it within an hour. A week later, this time you're taking it after a high fat meal. After the hour, you're not feeling it. So you think, oh, maybe I should take more because that's why I'm not feeling it. So people then take more. Then when you get that delayed hit, you now have a much higher dose. And that's really where people start to have the problems.
Cool. And then so if we're talking maybe about bioavailability, so whilst absorption that we just discussed is probably related to speed of how it gets into your system, with bioavailability, is it more how much of the compounds actually get into the system, regardless of speed? Is that another way to look at it?
Yeah, how much is the bioavailability is it tells you how fast and how much is kind of some of the key questions that you get from, like when you do a standard pharmacokinetic study, that's you're looking for is, I guess there's a few things. It was, when does the peak hit? How high is the peak? And then how long does it stick around? And the how long sticks around is fairly constant because that's your liver basically degrading it or metabolizing it. It's how high and how fast. Those are the ones that are the variable ones for the different dosage forms.
Right. Thank you. So are there any, this might be more relevant to you guys because of all of the other non-cannabis stuff that you do, but the non-cannabis ingredients, agents that are being added to kind of increase the absorption or deal with the adverse effects that you discussed?
Yeah, so I mean, probably I already referred to Maximil, so it's actually an omega-3 that definitely changes the absorption, and it looks like it also makes it faster. So I mean, our hope is that it does help people with their picking their dosing because they're getting a nice consistent level and it's hitting relatively fast. It won't be as fast as smoking, but relatively fast. So it makes it easier to play with your dose and find your right dose. We've also licensed a technology where actually it helps the absorption through the skin. So in one formulation, it was actually 10 times greater absorption through the skin. And what's even
Wow.
cooler is you can actually target. So 10 times was actual transdermal. So that means it goes all the way through and enters your bloodstream. But you can use this technology to target different layers. So if you want it to actually just stay in the skin, say maybe you were investigating, can it help with psoriasis? You can target that. So it mostly just stays in the skin. It doesn't go all the way through, which again is good because then if you're using a formulation with THC, you're not going to get the psychoactive effects because it's really just staying in the skin. It's not going through. So yeah, there's a lot of cool ways you can combine non-cannabis with the cannabis to really give some great synergies.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, probably so much to discover in that area. Are there any kind of other areas? Oh, sorry, just before we go on to that, actually, am I right in thinking that in terms of smoking as a route of administration, whilst it's, it's the quickest way, the heat, the very high heat from incineration, does it also kill a lot of cannabinoids and active compounds?
You get a, I mean, you get a decent bit out by smoking it. I mean, it definitely does. I guess it does destroy some, I would say, and you're not getting like 100% out of the plant material. It is better. What you're getting out of the plant material is a bit higher than say you ingest it, because most things, cannabis you ingest, usually around 5% actually gets absorbed, versus smoking it is higher than that. So because whatever's getting in the lungs is pretty much getting into your bloodstream, it ends up being that even some is destroyed by the smoking and it's left in the kind of the ash. At the end of the day, your absorption is higher than ingestion.
Right. Right. And vaping, is that kind of midway?
Vaping now is when it got started. I mean, 'cause I actually worked in my previous life. I worked with a bunch of different nicotine vape products, and really at first they kind of lagged behind combustion, and they were slower. We didn't get the good absorption, but the products have definitely, I guess, most probably the device actually has improved through the years. So now vaping is very similar to combustion in terms of the absorption, but obviously because you're not combusting, you're not producing all the carcinogens, all the stuff that is definitely being produced when you smoke cannabis.
Hmm. Right. Yeah. Good distinction. Cool. And are there any other promising areas in this development in this area at all?
We've seen some fantastic apps out there that are helping people, partially because we don't have, I think there's two components. We don't have enough the research, plus there's so much variability with people. So some of these apps that help track what you've taken and relate it to the effects you're seeing. I mean, I think those are some really interesting areas. We've looked at a few different, some technologies in that area ourselves. But I mean, the list goes, there's a lot of research going on in the industry. And I think it's just going to keep going up now that more and more countries they're allowing medicinal or talking about going full legalization. I mean, it's really the potential sales is what helps drive the innovation. So it's pushing forward really quickly now, which is great.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, you guys are very much focused on North America. Do you keep an eye on Europe as well and what's happening here?
Yeah, we definitely do. I mean, we do. I mean, back in when we were in the krill oil business, we sold a lot in Europe and a lot in Asia. It's definitely on our radar for when it comes to cannabis. So we either probably most likely will be with hemp products similar to what we produce in the U.S. So obviously very low THC. Europe's a little more restrictive in how much THC can be in there, but I mean, a lot of our products would meet the regulations quite nicely. And then in, I guess, countries that start allowing it more, I mean, definitely it'd be great to get in the cannabis side as well.
Yeah. Yeah. It's slow going here. We're a few years behind you guys. And I mean, it's not actually that dissimilar to the US in that, state versus federal type thing. We've got lots of states in Europe and everyone's doing it slightly
Exactly,
differently.
yeah.
But obviously the US market is definitely a few years ahead. So, but all of this lack of harmonization creates problems and opportunities, I guess.
Exactly, and I mean, it's our regulatory department's a full-time job of theirs to, I mean, keep up with what's going on in every 50 states because I mean, it's constantly changing. Even Canada, it's changing. They're talking about having what we call cannabis health products. As I mentioned, right now we're not allowed to make claims, but for cannabis health products, if it gets permitted, what they're talking about allowing is if you have the research to back it up, you may be allowed to make claims. So I mean, I think that's a great example of a really positive regulation that will help the industry and consumers because now people will do the studies to show their product works. So if you want something for insomnia, you know which one to grab.
Yeah, yeah. And then I guess that goes to the question of sort of funding then, because obviously research isn't cheap and it takes some time. So yeah, I guess you need some money to do that.
Yeah, you're 100%. I mean, it's very expensive to do the research, but we do this routinely. We do the ROI analysis to see, okay, if we spend X amount on the research, how long is it going to take us to recoup it? And by allowing companies to actually talk about the research they do and make claims based on the research, it really changes that ROI calculation because now you really are setting yourself apart versus right now, like I said in the beginning, you hope people feel the difference between your product and someone else's. It's very hard to market that difference. So it's definitely going to help.
Yeah. And I guess that's, maybe the evolution of the industry from sort of very much emerging to a bit more by people taking a slightly longer term of view. They're like, okay, I'm going to invest this money. It's going to take X amount of time to realize it, but it will put us in this position.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, clinical research it's not a fast process. It definitely takes time. And depending on, and something like insomnia where your effects are quite fast, it's not so bad. But I mean, there's certain like areas where, like I mentioned before, they're looking at it for depression, schizophrenia. Those studies take a long time. So you need to have deep pockets and there needs to be a big prize at the end to justify it.
Patient shareholders as well.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, thank you, Graham. It's been really, really interesting to talk to you, and I loved all that bit about absorption, and I'm sure we can go into much more detail. So thank you for joining me today, and it'd be great to have you on again at some point in the future to hear more about what you guys are up to.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Great. Cool. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
Cheers.